I jolted awake, startled by a sharp crack of branches and a sound that seemed like a rustling cutting through the forest's deep silence. My heart pounded as I strained to make sense of the noise. For a moment, I thought it might be the wind playing with the leaves, but the forest was too eerily still for that to be the case. I quickly propped myself up on my elbows, my breath coming in shallow bursts, and fumbled for my flashlight. I clicked it on, its beam slicing through the thick darkness of the camp with a harsh, artificial light. The flickering lights I had noticed before falling asleep were still there, shimmering between the trunks of the trees. They seemed almost playful, dancing in the darkness like some unseen presence teasing me. I tried to tell myself they were fireflies, but deep down, I sensed something more sinister. With a growing sense of unease, I got up and carefully stepped out of the tent, moving as quietly as possible to avoid alerting any potential enemy. My camp looked deceptively calm in the harsh light of the flashlight. However, the forest around me felt strangely alive. The distant rustles and whispers that had previously been unclear now seemed to grow louder and more pronounced. I swung the light around, hoping to catch a glimpse of the source of the flickering lights, but they flared up briefly and vanished every time I tried to focus on them. I began to walk around the camp, my movements deliberate and cautious. The wind rustled the leaves, creating intricate patterns of shadows that danced across the ground and my path. My anxiety mounted as I noticed the flickering lights leading me toward the forest's edge, where the trees were particularly dense and foreboding. I tried to trace the source of the light, but the darkness swallowed any details, leaving me only with a growing sense of dread. I returned to the camp and tried to calm myself. I returned to the tent and my fallen backpack, but the unsettling feeling of being watched never left me. Every slight rustle and twig crack made my heart race faster, amplifying my fear. I knew the forest was teeming with secrets, but I hadn't anticipated they would make themselves known so quickly. The night was only beginning, and already I had the distinct feeling that this expedition would be far more unsettling than I had ever imagined. When I finally reached the secluded clearing, my relief was almost physical. After hours of wandering through dense, nearly impassable forest areas, I found this perfect spot, a flat surface surrounded by tall trees and illuminated by a soft light filtering through the foliage. This was the exact place where I could fully enjoy the solitude of nature. At first, I carefully spread out my mat and sleeping bag. The air smelled of freshness and pine resin, a scent I hadn't experienced in a long time. Each breath was a pleasure, a reminder of why I had chosen this journey. I relished the feeling of being alone in this vast forest, with no sounds of civilization breaking the silence. It felt like reconnecting with a primordial part of the world that I had missed. Once the tent was set up, I ensured it was securely anchored. Even in this calm, I knew to be prepared for any surprises. As I laid out the ropes and hammered in the pegs, I was reminded of every detail's importance in this remote place. This wasn't a hike in a tourist park with amenities, but a true immersion into the wild, where every action mattered. When the tent was ready, I built a small fire, choosing a safe spot in the designated area. The warmth from the fire and its cozy flicker added comfort, and I relaxed, sitting nearby. The trees surrounding the clearing created a mesmerizing green screen, behind which lay the endless darkness of the forest. I savored this moment. There was no one around except me and the forest. All worries and hustle remained outside this woodland haven. I enjoyed simply sitting by the fire, watching the dancing flames, and listening to the sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and the gentle breeze passing through the trees. This moment was mine. It was filled with simple joy from being one with nature, and I knew this journey would be something special for me. Night fell almost imperceptibly. Everything that was daytime, the green tranquility of the forest and the sounds of wildlife, was swallowed by silence. As soon as I lay in my sleeping bag and turned off the flashlight, the forest around me became quiet. But as soon as I closed my eyes, strange sounds emerged from the silence. At first, there was a faint rustling in the bushes. I listened carefully, trying to figure out what was making the noise. The wind? No, it was too steady to create such rustling. I turned on the flashlight and illuminated the dark bushes, but I saw nothing. I went back into the tent, tried to calm myself, and closed my eyes again. But the rustling didn't stop. It not only grew louder, but also seemed to be getting closer and closer. Then I heard them. Whispers. They were so faint I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the sounds were so clear it felt like they were coming from the ground. I climbed out of the tent again and tried to find the source of the sounds. The forest was shrouded in darkness, and I pointed the flashlight in various directions. The whispers died down, but the rustling continued, giving me the impression that someone or something was hiding in the shadows. Just as I was about to return to the tent, I noticed flickering lights between the tree trunks. They appeared and disappeared, as if someone was subtly moving them. I approached closer, but they went out as soon as the flashlight illuminated the lights. I could feel my heart racing, and every forest movement seemed tense and ominous. The lights continued to flicker as I tried to approach again. They looked like tiny, ghostly stars dancing in the distance, and although I knew they could be reflections or fireflies, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I returned to the tent, sweating and nervously glancing around. I felt as if the forest around me was alive, watching me. With difficulty, I climbed back into the tent and tried to calm myself, but the rustling and whispers continued to disturb my peace. I cautiously emerged from the tent to investigate the source of the strange sounds and flickering lights that had woken me. The forest was engulfed in thick darkness, with only the beam of my flashlight cutting through it. With each step on the forest floor, I felt the darkness pressing in more profoundly, and the sounds that had seemed harmless now carried a sense of tension. I headed toward where I had seen the lights, but as I got closer, they vanished as if someone had turned them off. The wind rustled the leaves, and the noise was like the whispering of many voices. Every gust of wind seemed too loud, every shadow too strange. I peered into the darkness and listened to the sounds, but all I saw were trees standing like silent witnesses. The rustling in the bushes had also stopped, and I felt a strange sensation overcome me, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I checked several areas where the sounds had come from, but found only typical signs of wildlife and fallen leaves. The lights I had seen might have been mere moonlight reflections or fireflies, but they were gone now. I returned to the camp, trying to conceal my unease. At least I hadn't found anything specific that could explain these oddities. Everything seemed as it should in the forest at deep night, quiet and peaceful. Yet deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was beyond my understanding. The unknown and the darkness surrounding me were far more unsettling than anticipated. Eventually, I went back to the tent and tried to calm myself. But this night left me with a lingering sense of unease that wouldn't go away. All I had found was emptiness and silence, but I knew something wasn't right. In the morning, I woke up with unease that had plagued me all night. The wind rustled the leaves, creating unnaturally whispers, and I immediately knew something was off in the forest. I climbed out of the tent, trying to ignore the sensations, and decided to look around. My tent stood on a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. I began to walk along the trail leading deeper into the woods. The sun started filtering through the foliage, and the early light played with the shadows, creating a creepy atmosphere. As I approached the nearest trees, I was drawn to strange symbols carved into the bark. At first, I thought they were just random marks left by someone from the local area, but as I got closer, the symbols became increasingly detailed. They were carved deeply, and each mark was done with such precision that it seemed they held some hidden meaning. I tried to examine them more closely, but they remained obscure and enigmatic. The symbols looked ancient and ominous, their shapes so unusual that I couldn't find an explanation for them. They weren't carved into just one tree, but several around my camp, forming a circular pattern. My heart began to race. The forest, which had seemed so friendly and peaceful yesterday, now felt like a confined world where I was a prisoner. I stood there in complete confusion. These symbols were not just drawings, they were part of something more significant that I couldn't understand. I turned back to the camp, and the feeling that I was not alone became even more pronounced at that moment. The sensation that someone was watching me was more palpable. I realized that I wouldn't find peace in this forest if I didn't figure out these symbols. My quest for answers was beginning, and despite the fear overwhelming me, I was ready to delve into the mystery. At first, I tried to ignore the tension building in my chest. After discovering those symbols on the trees and having them appear in my dreams, I thought it was just a result of exhaustion. But as night fell, it became clear that it was something more. I sat by the fire, which now seemed inadequate protection against the forest's darkness. The flickering flames cast long, distorted shadows on the surrounding trees, and I couldn't shake the feeling that these shadows were moving with some purpose. I frequently listened to the sounds of the forest, but every rustle of the wind and every crack seemed too pronounced, as if they were deliberately meant to disrupt my peace. I walked around the camp, checking if anything had happened to my gear or the campsite. The feeling of being watched grew more robust every time I returned to the fire. It was as if someone hidden in the darkness was observing my every move. I felt a shiver run down my spine when I heard a sound behind me that resembled a whisper. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. I tried to shine the flashlight in that direction, but there was only darkness. Every sound in the forest, every movement of the shadows, became a source of anxiety. I even tried talking to myself to convince myself it was all just imagination. But the words sounded flat and unhelpful. With each passing hour, the night grew more sinister. The sounds I couldn't explain became more persistent. Fear enveloped me as if an invisible hand was squeezing my chest. Once, when I illuminated the trees around me, I saw some glowing dots flickering among the foliage. I didn't know if they were reflections, insects, or something else, but I knew that the forest was not just silence and tranquility. It was filled with mysterious and frightening secrets that now seemed too close. I tried to hold on, but each crack and each sound made me believe more and more that I wasn't alone and that this night could be a real test for me. I spent the night in a state of constant unease. The dense forest around my camp felt like a living entity that couldn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. With the first light, I emerged from the tent and decided to investigate the symbols I had discovered on the trees the day before. At first, I thought they were just random scratches, but on closer inspection, they seemed to be something more sinister. I began to circle the trees, carefully examining each mark. Some symbols were simple, but others were complex, with unusual curves and lines. I remembered reading about such symbols in mythology books, but none matched what I was seeing. My anxiety grew as I realized the symbols were not just random. They formed a closed circle around my camp. I didn't know what it might mean, but I felt something significant was hidden here. Deciding I needed answers, I started looking for clues in the forest that could explain their origin. After a few hours of wandering, I stumbled upon an old stone circle hidden in the thick vegetation. The stones were covered with the same symbols I had seen on the trees. My heart raced faster. The legends about ominous rituals in these woods began to feel real. The ground beneath me trembled as soon as I touched one of the stones. I heard a deep sigh as if the forest itself exhaled. A light breeze brought whispers that seemed unnatural, more like something sinister. I noticed the stones beginning to glow with a faint green light. My sense of dread reached its peak. I realized that the forest was not just a place for solitude. Something ancient and possibly dangerous lurked within its depths. My instincts told me I needed to leave immediately, but curiosity and fear paralyzed me. As I searched for a way out of the circle, the forest continued to whisper and beckon me further into its dark depths. I was watching the dancing flames by the fire when something caught my attention. Changes began occurring in the forest's darkness, and I felt the tension rising. The shadows playing on the trees started moving unusually, and the rustling sound in the bushes became sharper and more distinct. I stared into the darkness, but I could only make out a vague movement that I couldn't quite decipher. My nerves were on edge. I heard whispers that seemed too close, even though the area around me was empty. They were faint, but impossible to ignore, as if someone was trying to convey something important through the thin veil of night. I reached for my flashlight, but its beam only seemed to deepen the darkness that enveloped the forest, making things even more unsettling. Suddenly, one of the lights I had seen earlier reappeared, but now it was closer. It glided between the trees like a firefly, but its movements were too smooth and continuous to be an insect. With each step towards the light, I felt the forest becoming alive, almost tangible, filled with invisible threats. I approached a tree where I had recently noticed strange symbols. They seemed to glow in the darkness, and a shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly the forest stirred, and a figure emerged from the shadows, outlined in vague contours. It didn't resemble any creature I was familiar with. The figure moved smoothly and silently as if gliding over the ground. I froze, not knowing what to do. My breath hitched, and my mind raced with thoughts of what this could be. My heart pounded as the figure drew closer, and I noticed its eyes, or what seemed like eyes, gleaming like embers in the fire. I instinctively began to back away, but my legs felt rooted. The sensation of not being alone, of being watched and threatened, became almost physical. I grabbed my knife for emergencies and prepared for a possible confrontation. The forest was filled with sounds, and every rustle felt like a threat. It wasn't just fear. It was a real threat that could be deadly. My fingers glided over the cold surface of the tree as I examined the mysterious symbols carved around the campsite. The fading, rustling sounds and whispers grew louder and closer. I felt a rising tension in my chest, and my survival instincts began to signal alarm. I knew I had to act quickly. The forest's silence was overwhelming, broken only by my footsteps and the steady rhythm of my breathing. I decided to return to the tent and prepare for the nighttime threat. I lit a small fire to illuminate the area and carefully checked all my gear, arming myself with a knife and flashlight. The noises grew louder, as if the forest was alive and breathing. I began to formulate a plan. First, I needed to set up defensive measures around the camp. I used rope to stretch out several light strips, hoping they deter any potential attacks. All this preparation took place under the constant feeling of being watched. Night fell, and the forest became dark and foreboding. I sat by the fire, listening to every rustle and peering into the darkness. Suddenly, strange shadows emerged with the mist, like invisible creatures moving between the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and directed it at the shadow, watching it disappear into the forest's thick. I knew I couldn't stay here for long. The next step was to find a safe way out of the forest. I used the compass and map I had brought with me. I planned my route, orienting myself by the sun to head opposite where I had seen the flickering lights. Every step was tense, and every shadow and rustle heightened my fear. I followed my plan, crossing streams and avoiding rocky areas to remain undetected. The morning began to break through the trees, and the forest seemed less ominous. My heart pounded with tension, but I knew I was close to a safe exit. When I finally emerged from the forest, the daylight seemed incredibly bright. I looked back at the woods where I had spent the night and realized I had survived something that might have broken someone else. But it was just another confirmation of the survival instinct I had always respected and valued. I stood leaning against a tree, staring at the symbols carved into the bark. They shimmered in the light of my flashlight, seeming to come alive in the darkness. An indistinct symphony of rustles and whispers continued to echo in my mind, hard to ignore. The night stretched on, and I felt fear enveloping me deeper and deeper. From time to time, I glanced around to make sure no one was following me, but each time I turned, the emptiness of the forest only heightened my unease. I was torn between the desire to leave and the fear of what might be lurking in the dark. The strange, glowing lights I had seen during the night no longer seemed like mere play of light. Now they appeared as ominous eyes watching me. My attempts to decipher the symbols proved fruitless. The forest seemed alive, and every movement reminded me that I was an intruder. I had to decide whether to keep searching for a way out or prepare for the possibility that I might be unable to leave. My blood ran cold, realizing that any wrong move could be my last. When I finally decided to act, the forest seemed even more menacing. I gathered my things and headed where I thought the exit should be. But the forest seemed to warp space. Places I remembered no longer existed, and I felt myself getting lost in its depths. Each step felt like an eternity. My legs were weary, and my breath was heavy. I felt my strength waning, and when I saw lights flickering among the trees, I couldn't tell if they were real or a figment of my exhausted mind. I took one last step, and the forest opened up. To the left, a path leading to light was visible. I headed towards it, ready to leave this place forever. However, when I emerged into the clearing, it was just an imaginary exit. The forest closed around me again, and I wasn't sure I could find my way back. At that moment, I stood on the brink between reality and some unknown horror, in complete uncertainty about my fate. The forest engulfed me once more, and only silence remained my companion.